They spent one night together, then met again in court as enemies. The bass inside the underground club was not music, it was pressure, thick and tangible, beating against the walls and rattling the iron beams above. The building, an abandoned warehouse near the river, had been converted into a private arena for clandestine fights. Outside the law, inside the rules that only some understood, men entered the cage to break each other, while spectators, hidden in shadows, observed deals and whispered alliances. Silas Vale stood near the bar, leaning lightly against the worn wood. Not the cage interested him. He ignored the men colliding in the center. He watched the room, its movement, its patterns, its unspoken transactions. He noticed the subtle exchange of glances, the way hands twitched near hidden pockets, how alliances formed and dissolved without a word. The bartender slid a glass toward him. Single malt. Silas had not ordered it. He raised a brow. The bartender shrugged. Someone had already paid. He shifted his gaze and saw her. She stood alone, near a steel pillar. Dark hair tied loosely, simple black jacket. She did not need embellishment. Her eyes scanned the room with the precision of a predator, analyzing the crowd. She was a study in controlled stillness, assessing the room with the lethal precision of a grandmaster. Silas lifted his glass in silent acknowledgement, watching the way she moved, not with the hesitation of a stranger, but with the authority of someone who had already mapped every exit. When she reached the bar, she didn't wait for the bartender's attention. She simply stood until the space around her cleared, signaling for water with a sharp, minimal gesture. He took a slow sip. First rule of survival is knowing which strangers are dangerous. And she asked, "And you are not attempting poison?" That he finally looked at her. Eyes sharp, gray, maybe green, hard to tell in the dim light. She studied him like a complex equation. What makes you so certain? Because poison is inefficient. You do not enjoy inefficient solutions. That earned a pause, not a smile, but something close to interest. They stood there, quiet, as the cage erupted with the sound of bodies colliding. She didn't glance at it. "You do not care about the fight?" she asked. "No spectacle is for those who need witnesses. Real work happens quietly." "And what kind of work do you do?" He mirrored the question. "What kind do you think?" She observed him intensely. He was calculating, precise, aware. "You defend people," she said slowly. "People who cannot afford failure." That he allowed a slight smile. "Close enough to truth. And you?" He arched an eyebrow. "I solve problems created by people like you." That made him laugh, quietly. "So enemies?" "Not yet," she said. They drifted to a quieter corner. The roar of the cage faded into a low vibration. Silas felt curiosity, rare and dangerous. Her composure held it. He noted every subtle movement. She was alone, he confirmed, as was he. "You always interrogate strangers." "Only the interesting ones." Another cheer erupted from the cage. Silas remained unmoved. She noticed. "You really don't care?" "No, the outcome is predictable. Stronger man wins. Unless someone paid for a different outcome." That earned a faint smile. "You believe everything is manipulation." In my experience, it usually is." They observed each other. Two predators circling territory. Unspoken acknowledgement. Finally, she extended her hand. "Noah?" Silas did not hesitate. "Silas." Her handshake was firm. Not performative. He liked that. They moved to the edge of the warehouse, where the music softened. A row of tall windows revealed the black river outside, reflecting city lights and broken lines. "So," Noah said, "what do you actually believe?" He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "People like you always believe something," she said almost casually, but with an edge. He leaned against the railing. "I believe truth is overrated." That earned a sharper look. "Go on." In court," he said, "truth does not win. Stories win. The better narrative, the cleaner argument, the version people want to believe. That decides everything. And you proud of that?" "Pride isn't the word." He shrugged. "Reality." Noah studied the river. "I believe reality matters more than stories." He smiled. "Then you must be disappointed often." She turned to him. The tension was not hostile. It was electric, the clash of philosophies, neither intending to yield. Music shifted. Heavy rhythm. Crowd roared again. Glass somewhere shattered. A private party pretending to be chaos. She checked her phone. "I should leave." Silas nodded, but neither moved. Finally, he said carefully, "We should not see each other again." She raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dramatic." "No, just practical. People like us rarely meet by accident, and when we do, it usually ends badly. Noah considered. Then she asked the question that changed the night. What if we ignore practicality? Silas studied her expression. No hesitation. No game. Just curiosity mixed with something sharper. He finished the whiskey and set the glass down. Then he said quietly, "Then we make a bad decision." The hotel was 3 blocks away. They walked through cold night air without speaking. The city felt quieter outside the warehouse, less theatrical, more honest. The lobby clerk did not ask questions. Private establishments rarely did. They rode the elevator in silence. Silas noticed her calm, not nervous, not uncertain. She stepped into the room first, tossed her jacket on a chair. City lights spilled through the tall windows, painting silver lines across the floor. "This is the part," she said, "where people pretend it means something." That he loosened his cufflinks slowly. "We do not have to pretend." She crossed the room, standing close enough to see every detail of her expression. "So what does it mean?" "Nothing." He answered honestly. "And that's why it's honest." She studied him a second, then kissed him. Hours later, the room was quiet except for distant city traffic. She stood by the window, putting her jacket back on. Silas watched. "You leave early," he said. "Habit." She nodded. "Fair." She paused near the door. "One night." Silas said. "Yes, no names, no questions, no future." She opened the door, agreed. The door clicked softly behind her. Silas lay back, staring at the ceiling, feeling something unfamiliar. Not regret. Not satisfaction. Something closer to anticipation. Morning came with a dull gray sky, filtering through the tall windows of the courthouse. Silas arrived early. As always, he preferred the emptiness before the machinery of law filled the room. He placed his briefcase carefully on the defense table, checking files and notes with deliberate motions. Not because he needed reassurance, but because repetition sharpened timing. His eyes scanned the nearly empty gallery, catching subtle details. The scuff of a shoe on the marble, how sunlight shifted across the jury box. He heard the doors open behind him. He did not turn immediately. He already knew who it was. Noah. She moved with measured steps, carrying a stack of folders. Her gaze was precise, reading the room as if she owned it. She did not acknowledge him. He did not flinch. She placed her files on the prosecution table. "You always arrive before everyone else?" she asked calmly. He allowed a faint smile. "Habits." She studied him. "A man who does not flinch, does not wait, does not hesitate." He shrugged. "Routine creates the illusion of stability. Stability breeds trust. People trust what appears unshakable." She gave a subtle nod. As the judge entered, the courtroom settled into tense silence. The press crowded the back benches. Reporters poised with notebooks and cameras. Hallberg's name had become headline material. Public outrage mixed with fascination, Silas observed. The jury shifting slightly, leaning forward. The first day's proceedings had already complicated their perception. 3 months ago, a pedestrian, Peter Kovacs, a teacher walking home from night classes, had been struck and killed by Daniel Hallberg, son of a tech billionaire. The footage had circulated endlessly. The accident was violent, unforgiving. Drugs were involved. Public opinion demanded justice. Silas glanced at his client, sitting stiffly behind him. Daniel looked pale, nervous, hands trembling. Slightly, he leaned closer, whispered instructions. "Do exactly as I said. Nothing more? Nothing less." Daniel nodded quickly, eyes wide. The judge called the courtroom to order. Noah stepped forward when the signal came, opening her statement with calm precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, 3 months ago, Peter Kovacs left his classroom at 9:15 p.m. He walked home the same way he had for 15 years. Every detail of his routine is known. The lights he turned off, the keys he carried, his steps echoing. Softly against the pavement, at 9:23 p.m., a black Aston Martin accelerated through a red light, 80 miles per hour. Peter Kovacs never reached the other side of the street. She allowed the pause to settle in the room, his body thrown across asphalt. The driver, Daniel Hallberg, was under the influence of cocaine and stimulants. A small murmur rippled through the jury box. Noah continued. "It is not wealth. It is not status. It is responsibility. When a person chooses to drive while intoxicated, they choose risk for everyone else on the road. Peter Kovacs did not choose that risk. He paid for someone else's recklessness with his life. Silas watched, noting how she built tension without theatrics. Silence was her ally. Her delivery was surgical that he rose slowly, approaching the center of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he began softly. You just heard a tragic story. It is tragic that a man died. No one disputes that. But tragedy is not the same as murder. The prosecution wants you to believe the case is simple, reckless. Rich boy, speed, drugs. Case closed. He paused, letting the room absorb it. Truth in law is rarely simple. Observation matters. He turned slightly toward the jury box. The narrative they had seen on television was incomplete. By the end of this trial, you will realize something crucial. The story you were told at the beginning was not the full story. And when the whole story appears, you will have only one option under the law. Not guilty. He returned to his table, briefcase closed, face calm. The judge called. The first witness, traffic analysts, medical examiners, video footage slowed frame by frame. The prosecution's case, once clear, now felt nuanced. The jury exchanged glances, processing contradictions. Silas introduced doubt where it mattered. Expert testimony questioned, details dissected. Noah countered with structured precision, each fact a hammer against uncertainty. By late afternoon, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. Cases that look obvious in headlines often unravel under scrutiny. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors leaned in, trying to reconstruct a coherent story. Silas gathered his papers, walking toward the hallway where the corridors were quieter. Reporters crowded the opposite end, hoping for statements. He stopped a few feet from Noah. She waited. Unflinching. I see you've maintained your habit of arriving early, she said, her voice dropping to a private frequency. Silas didn't turn. And I see you've maintained your habit of prosecuting the impossible. She stepped beside him, her presence a cold contrast to the warmth of the previous night. I checked the filings, Silas. You've been on the Hallberg defense for 3 weeks. You knew exactly who was leading the prosecution before you ever stepped into that club. He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. Strategy is about environment, Noah, not just the opponent. That irritated her slightly. Of course it did. She studied him carefully. You believe he didn't do it? Silas shrugged. Belief is irrelevant. I believe the prosecution hasn't proven beyond reasonable doubt. She stepped closer, voice lowered. That wasn't the question, and that isn't the game you're playing. He met her gaze calmly. I don't play games. I construct narratives. Noah's eyes narrowed. Then let me give you the next chapter. Hallberg's blood results are only the beginning. We will introduce evidence placing him at 3 separate parties that night with witnesses confirming drug use. He nodded slowly. That will look unpleasant. Unpleasant influences juries. You sound confident. She studied him again, but his calm unsettled her. You already know what our next move is, don't you? Silas tilted his head. Did I make it a habit to anticipate possibilities? That is not an answer. She held his gaze long enough to send a clear warning. Finally, stepping back. This ends one way, Silas, he asked. Quietly. In what way is that? Justice. She turned and walked back to the courtroom, leaving Silas with a faint smile. Not for triumph, but because conflict meant movement, and movement meant opportunity. But beneath it lingered the memory of the night before, the way she had looked at him, unshielded, before the world imposed roles. He pushed it away. Work first. Always work. The trial continued, and somewhere far above, another pair of eyes watched intently. Bennett Vick, glass office overlooking the city, muted. Broadcast of the courtroom. His thin smile suggested anticipation. This is getting complicated, he murmured. Call Silas. Find out everything about the prosecutor. Noah? The game was about to expand, and neither Silas nor Noah yet understood how dangerous it would become. Evening settled over the city as Silas walked toward the glass tower of Bennett Vick's consultancy, its dark silhouette reflecting in the wet streets below. He entered through a side entrance, avoiding the press and the prying eyes of the public. Elevator doors closed silently behind him, carrying him up to the top floor, where a panoramic view of the city stretched endlessly. Bennett Vick stood behind a polished black desk, arms crossed, watching the skyline. His presence filled the room before he spoke. Welcome, Silas, he said, voice smooth, but edged with a quiet threat. Silas closed the door behind him, meeting the gaze without flinching. Vick finally turned, studying him sharply. like a cat appraising a clever mouse. You've been busy today? Silas, I try to stay productive, he replied lightly. I've been watching the trial. Silas, observing every move, each gesture, each reaction, each misstep. Silas remained still, calm. As always, the man who controlled half the city's legal machinery now controlled Silas's immediate options. You understand why I called you? Vic's eyes glinted. Yes, he said carefully. I suppose I do. You're clever, Silas, but don't mistake familiarity for immunity, Vic said, his steps heavy on the polished floor. I'm giving you a binary choice. The Hallberg case dies, or the career of your prosecution lead, and your own, burns by sunrise. He stopped, leaning over the desk to invade Silas's space. I have the surveillance from the warehouse club and the hotel. The ethics board doesn't care about honesty in the dark. They care about collusion. You can plant evidence against the prosecutor, Noah, the one threatening to unravel everything. Or I release the photographs from last night, the ones that might destroy both your reputations. Silas's jaw tightened slightly. Choice? He inclined his head. Choice, indeed. Your client's life, your career, your personal entanglement. All hanging by a thread. Silas spoke evenly. I do not manipulate the law for personal gain. He leaned back slightly. Your personal entanglement? Vic's lips curved in a thin smile. I see you care for her more than your own safety. She did leave a mark, did she not? Silas remained expressionless. I work. Only work. Vic's smile deepened. This is where you will learn the difference between law and survival. Vic walked closer, circling the desk, studying Silas's reactions, looking for the flicker of hesitation. Any flicker could be exploited. Do you understand what is at stake? Every option is compromised. All consequences immediate. Silas's fingers flexed slightly, resting on his briefcase. I understand perfectly, Vic. And the moment I betray my own principles, I will lose far more than you can take away. Silas spoke softly, each word deliberate. And if I refuse? Vic paused, studying him with narrowed eyes. The release of the photos. He said finally. A weapon aimed at your mutual destruction. Silas's mind cataloged every possible outcome. He could sabotage Noah's career, break the prosecution, save Hallberg, or resist and risk exposure. His conscience weighed heavier than any courtroom strategy. He had never faced a choice like this. Not a legal puzzle, but a moral crucible. A choice that forced him to reconcile work, desire, and truth. Vic stepped back, leaning casually against the desk. Yes, always. He exuded control, calm and lethal at once. Silas remained still. I will consider my options, he said slowly. Vic chuckled, thin, quiet, like a blade sliding over stone. Consider wisely. Your next move will determine everything. Silas left the office without another word. The elevator descended silently into the city below, each floor passing like a heartbeat. He walked into the night streets, feeling the chill, thinking of Noah, the woman who had challenged him, provoked him, haunted his thoughts. She was unaware of the new dimension now entering the game. Both of them still thought the trial and their rivalry were the main story. Yet outside the courtroom, another player had shifted the board. Silas clenched, his fists slightly as he crossed the street. He glanced toward the darkened windows of the skyscraper, knowing Vic was watching, calculating. Every step he took felt weighted. Each decision now carried the potential to destroy careers, lives, even love. He inhaled deeply. Night air crisp, the city alive with noise, traffic, indifference. He reminded himself of the rules of engagement. Focus, anticipation, control. Everything else was a distraction, but thoughts of Noah lingered. He remembered her glance, the firmness in her handshake, the way she had confronted him in the hotel room. Her intelligence had pierced through his usual defenses. Her presence was not merely attraction. It was challenged. He knew the moment he failed to navigate Vic's choice, he would put them both in jeopardy. Not just professionally, personally. The game was no longer confined to the courtroom. It had expanded into every aspect of their lives. Vic had just turned their quiet rivalry into a lethal, high-stakes conflict. And neither Silas nor Noah had yet realized how deep the trap would go. The next morning, the courtroom felt like a pressurized chamber. Noah didn't look at Silas as she entered, but the air between them was electric, charged with the weight of the previous night's warning. Every objection, Every pointed question to the medical examiner was a coded message, a test of the fragile boundary between their duty and the looming threat from Vic's shadow. Night fell over the city, streets slick with rain and reflections from neon signs. Silas moved through the alleyways with practiced precision, avoiding cameras, avoiding attention. The trial had ended for the day, but the tension between him and Noah had not dissipated. They met again, as if drawn by some dangerous gravity, at a discreet rooftop bar far from the prying eyes of reporters and surveillance. Silas arrived first, leaning against the railing, watching the river shimmer below, lights mirrored on the water like broken glass. She appeared moments later, her coat cinched at the waist, boots clicking softly on the concrete floor. Silas did not rise. She observed the city briefly. Then her gaze found his. "You came early," he said. "I like to see the scene before the players arrive." Noah replied. "Observation is a weapon." Silas smiled faintly, acknowledging her accuracy. She approached, standing close enough to make him aware of her presence without speaking. A silent duel began. Words unnecessary. They ordered drinks without ceremony. Silas studied her posture, noting every subtle movement. She did the same. Both aware of the stakes, aware that each interaction could reveal strategy or vulnerability. The city hummed around them, but they existed in a bubble of calculated proximity. She leaned slightly, voice low. "If someone saw us here, what would they think?" Silas glanced at the edge of the rooftop, then back at her. "They would think nothing." He raised his glass. She matched the gesture, hesitating just a second before drinking. The air between them carried the adrenaline of risk. Moments of silence stretched, punctuated by the distant sound of traffic and the occasional siren. She broke it. "I suppose we should discuss the trial," he said, calm, neutral. She shook her head. "Not here. Not now." She arched an eyebrow, challenging. He leaned closer, voice dropping. "Another observer might think we were playing with fire." She tilted her head. "A dangerous game is more interesting when fire is real." Silas felt the familiar thrill of calculation intertwined with a rare pulse of desire. They circled each other silently, their movements measured, each aware of how much information could be extracted from subtle gestures. The slight laugh escaped her. Silas noticed it was not amusement. It was tension relief, acknowledgement of mutual understanding. He responded with a faint smile. The drinks arrived. She lifted her glass, noting the reflection of his eyes in the liquid. Every glance, he thought, could be a question. Every pause, a test. Every touch, a potential leak of strategy. They spoke in fragmented sentences, never fully revealing intentions, but always extracting data from each other. A comment about evidence here, a question about a witness there. A subtle test of reactions. They were predators using conversation as weapons, each exchange a probe, each laugh a distraction. The night deepened. A storm approached across the river, wind whipping along the rooftop, adding urgency to each gesture. Silas stepped closer, just enough for heat to brush her arm. She did not recoil. She raised her glass. "I suppose," he said, breaking the tension slightly, "that this is what lawyers do when they are not in court." "Explore vulnerabilities?" she asked. She shrugged, smile faint. "I call it data gathering." She tilted her head. "Well, then, Mr. Vale, consider this an official audit." Silas laughed softly. Audit accepted. They moved closer to the railing, silhouetted against the stormlit sky, aware that proximity was both risk and advantage. His mind cataloged her reactions. She cataloged his. Each subtle smile, each flicker of movement, each micro-expression noted. Their rivalry had transformed into something deeper, a silent dependency on the exchange of intelligence, of tension, of risk. The night passed with no promises, no confessions, only the adrenaline of knowing they were dangerously exposed to one another and to anyone who might watch. From the rooftop, Silas watched her leave at the end, coat drawn tight, heels clicking down the fire escape. She vanished into the streets, leaving him with the echo of anticipation and the knowledge that tomorrow they would be back in court, opponents yet bound by this perilous connection. And somewhere above the city, Vic watched through discreet channels, smiling thinly, knowing, always knowing, that every step they took outside the courtroom fed into a strategy far larger than either of them could yet perceive. The game had evolved. Vic didn't wait for Silas to sit. He threw a manila envelope onto the desk, the edge of a photograph, Silas's hand on Noah's shoulder, peeking out like a blade. Principles don't win cases, Silas. Compromise does, Vic whispered. Silas stared at the image, the cold realization hitting him. The trap wasn't just about the trial. It was about the total erasure of their identities if he didn't strike first. Silas understood the board had shifted, and the stakes were now lethal. The night was heavy with rain, water streaming down the office windows, distorting the city lights. Silas sat alone in his apartment, briefcase unopened, notes scattered. He replayed the morning's confrontation with Vic, each word echoing in his mind. He could not shake the weight of the choice. Betray Noah and survive professionally, or refuse and risk everything. He poured a glass of whiskey, swirling it slowly, watching the amber liquid catch the dim light. His thoughts returned to Noah, the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the calm precision with which she dismantled arguments in court, her unwavering moral code. She was not just an opponent. She was a force. He realized with a pang that he had never felt like this before. Not desire, not infatuation, but genuine care. She was his moral mirror, and that frightened him. He knew he could not manipulate her without betraying himself. The thought made his hands tremble slightly. That he leaned back, letting the glass settle. He had spent a lifetime spinning narratives, controlling perception, turning truth into story. But she, Noah, saw through the fabrications, challenged them, forced him to confront reality in ways he had avoided. He remembered the last encounter on the rooftop, the silent exchange of power and information, adrenaline laced with curiosity. They had become addicted to the tension, each meeting a dangerous game, each glance a risk of exposure. And now Vic had entered the equation, turning their personal tension into a weapon. Silas realized the stakes had shifted. The trial, once the center of his strategy, was now intertwined with survival, ethics, emotion, desire. He could no longer separate professional from personal. He tried to draft mental strategies, calculating moves in the courtroom, possible counters for Noah's questions, anticipating her reactions, but each calculation was clouded by the thought of protecting her. She did not deserve to be a pawn. She deserved truth. She deserved fairness. Silas drained the whiskey. Slamming the glass down on the table, he rose abruptly, marching to the window. Watching rain slice across the city skyline, he felt the weight of indecision, of conflicting loyalties, pressures converging on all sides. That he knew he had to act, or risk total collapse. The first step would be confession. To Noah, though the idea terrified him. She might never forgive him, though he had yet to actually betray her. But secrecy was no longer an option. That he had to play on two fronts. Maintain his defense in court, protect Hallberg, while secretly shielding Noah from Vic's manipulations. That a delicate balance. Any misstep catastrophic. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, trying to center himself. But even as he centered, images of her flashed. Her eyes, her stance, her unwavering moral certainty. He realized he would cross lines he had never imagined, and yet each step toward her safety would leave him vulnerable professionally, legally, emotionally. That a knock at the door broke his concentration. He did not move immediately, eyes fixed on the rain. Another knock, louder. He approached cautiously, hand hovering near the doorknob. She was there. Noah, standing in the doorway, coat damp, expression unreadable. Silas froze. She stepped inside without hesitation. The room smelled faintly of rain and perfume. She held his gaze. Silas swallowed hard. That I need to talk, he said, voice low. She crossed the room, standing near the window. That I suppose so, she said, calm, controlled, but tense. Her presence intensified the moral pressure, reminding him of what he was protecting, what he could lose. That he motioned toward the couch. She remained standing. Silas spoke first. That I'm in a situation, complex, ethical, professional, and it affects you. She studied him in silence. That he felt every second stretch, weighty with potential fallout. He took a slow breath. I cannot compromise you. I will not betray you. She raised an eyebrow. Meanwhile, you are under pressure from forces you do not fully see. He paused. She did not move. I am in a position where choices could destroy careers, lives, including yours. Her eyes narrowed, not threatening, calculating. She finally asked, are you telling me I should trust you? Silas met her gaze steadily. I am telling you the truth. She considered that carefully. The storm outside mirrored the tension inside. He could not lie. She knew he was holding information, balancing on an ethical knife's edge. He wanted her to understand he was now an ally, despite appearances. Each decision he would make from this point would be guided by her safety, even if it meant risking everything else. The silence between them was thick, charged with anticipation and the knowledge that the game had changed irreversibly. Both were now bound, not by trust, not yet, but by necessity. And the next day, the courtroom would become not just a battleground for Hallberg's fate, but a stage for a far more dangerous play, one orchestrated by Bennett Vick, with Silas and Noah forced to navigate every step carefully, aware that one misstep could be fatal to all they held dear. Rain fell in heavy sheets, slapping against the courthouse windows as Noah exited the courtroom, briefcase clutched tightly under her arm. Her mind replayed the trial, sifting through testimonies, witness statements, evidence. Yet beneath the legal calculations lurked another awareness. Danger. Silas followed at a discreet distance, keeping his presence unnoticed. He had watched Vic's moves, the subtle manipulations, hidden threats, each calculated to corner them both. He sensed the escalation, and tonight, Noah would come face to face with the real threat. The fluorescent lights hummed as Noah reached for the Hallberg files, unaware of the shadow detaching itself from the archives. She heard the click of a safety, a sound too mechanical for the empty building. Before she could turn, Silas slammed the door open, his shoulder catching the intruder mid-lunge. He pinned the man's wrist against the metal frame with a sickening crack, sending a silenced pistol skittering across the linoleum. Vic isn't playing for a mistrial anymore, Silas breathed, his suit jacket torn at the seam. He's cleaning the board. If we're here in 5 minutes, we're dead. Move. They reached a small, abandoned garage, door pulled closed behind them that a temporary sanctuary, but neither relaxed. Outside, rain continued, wind howling, echoing like a warning. Noah finally allowed herself a breath. Leaning against the wall, Silas studied her silently at a moment of raw vulnerability, rare for her. She met his gaze, understanding passing between them. They were bound now, not by trial or attraction alone, but by survival. Each decision from this point forward would be shared, strategic, personal. They could not falter. And far above the city, Vic watched, smile tight, calculating next moves. The pieces were in motion, accelerating toward an outcome only he controlled. But Silas and Noah had crossed a line. Once shadows became real threats, alliances were no longer abstract. They were necessary, and the stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. Law, desire, and survival colliding in a single, lethal game. Dawn broke gray and tense over the city, streets still wet from the storm. The trial resumed. But for Silas and Noah, their reality had shifted from legal strategy to survival. They sat at opposite tables, publicly adversaries, yet privately allies in a war no one else understood. Silas's mind raced through every possibility, calculating moves, anticipating countermoves, while also monitoring Noah's reactions. She was precise, controlled, yet he could see the subtle signs, tiny pauses, brief hesitations, indicators of concern, of exhaustion, of awareness that danger still lurked beyond the courthouse walls. The judge called the morning session, starting with new evidence. Silas rose slowly, placing his notes in order. The jury watched intently. The prosecution presented a witness claiming to have seen Hallberg leave the scene at a different time. Silas questioned with surgical precision, highlighting inconsistencies, forcing doubt, without overplaying that he returned to his table, watching Noah respond. She countered each move expertly, each question designed to solidify the narrative of responsibility. Silas noted how she adjusted to his cross-examination, how she readjusted her strategy in real time. He allowed a faint smirk. Every micromove mattered. During a brief recess, Silas stood by the water fountain in a blind spot of the hallway cameras. Noah approached, her pace steady. "The logistics witness is a plant," Silas whispered, his back to her. Vic's fixer used the same courier service for the payoff and the vehicle swap. He subtly dropped a folded transcript of private wire transfers onto the ledge. Noah swept it into her folder without breaking stride. "Then I'll lead him into the contradiction on the record," she replied, her voice barely audible. You just make sure the judge doesn't shut down the line of questioning. They would manipulate the courtroom narrative without betraying facts, forcing Vic's true puppet, the hidden murderer, to reveal himself. Back in the courtroom, the day stretched long. Testimonies piled one atop the other. Evidence presented with meticulous care. Questions volleyed between Silas and Noah like tactical strikes, each calibrated to provoke reaction or error. They were publicly opponents, yet every subtle maneuver coordinated privately. They shared a language of glances, gestures, subtle pauses, all unnoticed by others. Mid-afternoon, Silas noticed the jury shifting subtly, their focus sharpening on contradictions. They had planted seeds of doubt, coordinated, precise. Noah countered, highlighting the importance of accountability, never acknowledging coordination. Silas smirked slightly internally. Every strategy now funneled toward one purpose: forcing the real perpetrator into exposure. After the final recess, they returned to the courtroom with a shared understanding, unspoken but absolute. The stage was set. The evidence, carefully planted inconsistencies, subtle psychological cues, all aligned to corner the true criminal. Their personal tension had evolved into professional synergy, each aware that one misstep could unravel everything. From the gallery, reporters sensed a shift, but could not articulate it. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, each juror processing the intricate dance before them. Silas watched Noah, reading micro-expressions, preparing his final moves. She did the same, mirroring, complimenting, anticipating. Outside, unseen, Vic monitored, calculating that his control had extended beyond expectation, but underestimating the depth of Silas and Noah's coordination. By the end of the day, both understood they had crossed the point of no return. Personal trust and professional risk intertwined irrevocably. The trial was no longer a mere legal contest. It was a high-stakes game where law, ethics, desire, and survival collided. They left the courthouse together, unspoken agreement guiding every step that a storm had passed, the city wet and reflective, mirroring their fragile alliance. Tonight, they would prepare for the final legal gambit, aligning every piece, anticipating every counter, ready to confront Vic and the true perpetrator. Silas glanced at Noah briefly. She met his gaze, an unspoken acknowledgement. Whatever happened next would define them forever. The jury foreman stood, the silence in the room absolute. Not guilty. A roar erupted in the gallery, but Silas didn't look at his client. As the courtroom cleared, he intercepted the lead detective in the corridor, sliding a flash drive into the man's palm. The Hallberg kid was the passenger, Silas said, his voice a low rasp. The drive has the dashboard telemetry and the toll bridge footage of Vic's fixer behind the wheel. The cocaine belongs to him, too. Noah was waiting on the rain-slicked steps, her badge already tucked away in her bag. We're done, Silas. No firm in this city will touch us after we burned a billionaire and a billionaire's son in the same hour. Silas gripped his briefcase, watching the first blue lights converge on Vic's tower across the square. Good, he said, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. I was getting tired of the fiction.